So tonight we're going to be covering top event issues from Nayawin Rar Lodge 296. But as part of tonight, I want to really kind of look at some of the older stuff. I don't really know as much. I can't speak with firsthand experience to it, but I'll try to explain why I think some of the issues are maybe harder and try to relate them back to kind of general changes or events or influencing factors that maybe you can look at and say, was our lodge going through something similar? If you want to apply figuring out why are these events or why are these particular patches hard? I do want this to, maybe apply to people outside of just people who are interested in my own lodge's event patches. So we'll do that. I will mention there was a slight technical issue tonight. I planned to walk us through Patch Vault because I'm the Patch Vault editor and I have everything all nice and neat and 600 DPI images up on Patch Vault, and Patch Vault is down tonight. I've reached out to Todd and I made him aware of the issue that the website was down. When I made him aware of the issue, he gave me a long technical thing that I didn't understand, like a single word from beginning to end of, but they're working on it. Something with the host, people who host the website or whatever, it's some error on their end. So it should be resolved soon, so don't worry. But for right this moment, Patch Vault is down, so I can't do the presentation there. So what I have done is I have dusted off the old book I wrote in 2015, and we're going to just flip through the pages of that while I kind of I'm going through the decades. And I quickly, because I learned about this about 15 minutes before the presentation tonight, and I scanned the last couple pages of my collection book, I have the pictures of the images for you to see of the more recent issues, and we'll discuss them because, to be honest, some of the more interesting things I can talk about is really about the more recent ones because that's what I'm more intimately aware of what was going on at that time. So without any further ado, we're going to go ahead and get into it. So first, our first event patches came out in the 1960s. You have the EX 1962. You also have these other issues that were issued from 65 through 69. I will say all of these patches have to be looked at in kind of two different viewpoints or perspectives as far as difficulty. We're a very small lodge. We've never been a big lodge. We're only 4 small counties in North Carolina out of 100 counties. So we're not a big lodge. We never made a lot of any of these patches. So just kind of keep that in mind. So they're hard from that perspective. At the same time, there really has been, at least to me, a downtick in the number of collectors going after these in recent years. We've not had a lot of local collector interest in collecting patches, and so a lot of these pieces are, I would consider, relatively easy to how they were at one point in time. At one point in time, if someone had asked me what the value was of a EX 1962, I would have told them that it was a $100 patch. Well, the reality is today that it's probably a $25 patch. So I'm going to kind of go through these and discuss them. The first patch is kind of an interesting one just because it's so weird. It was a patch made for these different there were leadership trainings, and the date segments were intended to be cut away, and you would keep the ones on it for the years you attended the training. In reality, there must have been a bunch of them left uncut, or a lot of them were issued in 64 or in 65 or something. All I know is that I have seen very few that were actually cut. I've only seen a handful. So most of these that you find, seemingly to me at least, you find most of them in mint. So that's just kind of interesting. Really, the 65, 66, 67 are all fairly hard patches. I attribute this to something that was going on in our council at the time. And this can certainly play a factor in a local lodge's issues, and that's the support it's getting from the local council itself. We did not host a conclave between 1957 and 1977. So there was a 20-year period where we did not host a conclave. A lot of that has to do with, from my understanding, obviously I wasn't there, but my understanding is a lot of that had to do with the how the scout executives, how they felt about the Order of the Arrow. They felt that it took away from the troop. They felt that it took away from the council, and they wanted to focus on council events. So they had the Pilgrimage to Bath, which was this enormous council event in 1968. And really, until I would say sometime in the 70s, the attitude of council first, really, we don't really need the OA, did not go away. So that's, in my opinion, that is why these issues from the 60s are hard, is just because it was a small lodge, and there really were not a lot of people participating in lodge events. Even though we're a small area, there was even a smaller group of people participating. They were doing all these council events. So anyway, so you have the 65, 66, 67. These are all fairly hard. The 67 is the only patch we ever made that was a Harvest Fellowship. So that's kind of notable just in that regard. The 68, is Fall Fellowship. 69, this is so long ago, I don't think anybody really knows why, but for some reason, the 69 patch is much easier than all the other ones from the 1960s. I don't know why. It just is. So I kind of broke these down by decade as far as what patches I thought were hard. Really, all the ones from the 60s except the 69 are what I would consider fairly difficult. They're really, you really don't see them very often other than the 69. Getting into the 70s, the 71 patch is probably the most common of all of them. And I'm sorry, there might be one or two. When I wrote this book, maybe I was missing one or two patches, and there might be one or two missing. But really, through the 70s, I would say that none of these are particularly hard. The two that I thought were a little harder is this one that's missing, and it's a kind of an oval top, oval bottom, straight edge sides with the 4 lakes depicted from Camp Tuscarora on it. And the reason I thought it was a little harder one, it was our first Spring Fellowship patch. All these other ones were Fall Fellowship, with the exception of the Harvest Fellowship. But it was our first Spring Fellowship patch, and maybe it was a smaller attendance. I don't know. We didn't have another Spring Fellowship patch for quite a while. But that patch to me always seemed like probably around it, and the 78 Fall were around the hardest ones from the 70s. And so the 78 Fall is this one, and I just don't seem to see it as much. Most of the other ones from the 70s to me all seemed fairly easy. I don't know why they had a Spring Fellowship that one year in 73, and then they didn't have a patch for another one until 80. That's just what they did. You start to see more patches going into the 80s, and I think this is just kind of consistent across most lodges. You see them start to make more over time. Most of these patches are not that hard. Some of these patches, like a conclave shakedown, it's a different term, but it was really more, my understanding is basically a Spring Fellowship. They just called it the conclave shakedown because that was a year before we hosted conclave, but it's not particularly hard. The patch that is particularly hard is this 1986 patch. Why is it so difficult? I really don't know. I can just tell you that patch is a bear, and it's a Fall Fellowship, just a regular normal event. I really don't know why it's particularly hard. I just know that for a lot of collectors, it's going to be one of the last event patches you get. It's just really hard. The rest of these, once again, at one time, some of these were, maybe a little difficult to find, but they've just come out, and with lack of demand to absorb them, they're just not very difficult. Now we get into the 1990s. This is when they really started making even more patches than the 80s, and you'll see the trend as it continues. But this is where they started making basically every single year, they had 2 patches. They had a spring fellowship and a fall fellowship, and sometimes they would throw the word ordeal around. But since we have our ordeals on our fellowship weekends, they're really, for the most part, can be used interchangeably. So none of these are particularly hard. The one that is hard, and I don't have one pictured, I do have one I can show you at the end, is the 1995 Arrowhead. It's kind of interesting to see what I was still missing at the end of my collecting in 2015, because I was almost complete. But that is a hard patch. One was recently on eBay, and it sold for like $5. So I don't really think there's necessarily a lot of demand for Nayawin Rar event patches. But to me, that is a cursed patch. And the reason I'll tell you why I think it's cursed, it was one of my last needs, and I bought one sight unseen. I'd reached out to a number of big collectors and said, look, these are my last needs. I'm willing to pay, and I told a number that I thought was like an exorbitant price. I think I said like $25 or $30 or something for one of these. And I said, you know, I really want to fill this last need. And a collector said, oh, well, I have one. I'll send it to you. And so I sent him a check, and he sent me the patch. And it came in, and the patch was stained. And I thought, are you kidding me? You know, I paid a lot more than I thought the patch was realistically worth, but it came in and it was stained. And I'm like, I'm kind of like, oh, I'm not happy with this. Well, I bought that one on eBay for $5 when it popped up, thinking, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. I'm finally getting a mint copy of the patch. 'Cause I'll be honest, I don't think I've ever seen another one of those available in the time I've been collecting, just those two. And so I bought it for like $5 or $6. And it came in the mail, and it was stained. It has a really light stain on the front, and that I couldn't see in the picture. And I'm just sitting there going, are you kidding me? I am never going to have a mint copy of this patch. So to me, that is just a cursed patch. So I'll show you it at the end. The other patch that I would say is difficult from the 1990s, I guess it does make sense. It's kind of funny to see this. It was the other one I was missing. It is this exact design, but it is blue. And it's a very distinctive patch because it was our first ever winter banquet patch. So it's this patch in blue. The other thing that's notable is that at the banquet that year, they had our 50th anniversary celebration. And there were a number of patches that were given out that were really treasured by lodge members that had to do with the 50th anniversary. And so it has, in this space here on it does have like 50 years, or it has 50 something in gold mylar thread. And so I think people saw it almost as like an anniversary piece, you know, since it came out at the banquet. And it's just one of those things that people treasured it more because of that. None of the rest of these from the 90s are particularly difficult. You do get into these two. Now, this, what we call the EX19XX-2, I actually think came first. I think this came out, my understanding is that it came out in the 80s. I did not renumber these. I just left them. I probably should have just renumbered them, but I think it came out in the 80s. This other one came out in the 90s. The 19XX-1 was used for multiple years, and it's possible that there were more than one loom run of them, because we know that there's a left and a right twill of it. So, and they're pictured on Patch Vault, so you can see them there if you'd like to. But they were an ordeal patch, and so, and we'll talk about this in a minute with some other patches, but whenever you have something that's given to a smaller subsection of people in the lodge, it gets harder, regardless of what that is. If it's a chapter, or in this case, if it's ordeal candidates, it gets harder. And it really gets hard because, in the case of ordeal candidates, because a lot of them get the patch, and they may or may not come back to other lodge functions. So I do not believe these patches have an extraordinary monetary value necessarily today. I think these are probably $20, $30 patches. At one time, I remember Wes. He had one of these when I needed it, and he wanted over $100 in trade for it. And I will say, in fairness to him, I have seen very, very few of them over the years. And that was well before we only learned about the left and right twill variety of the top of the patch recently. So the bottom one was a training patch. No one's ever been sure what year. I'm pretty sure that it was late 80s. And that has to do with one that I saw in a one person's grouping of items, and that he had kind of displayed in a shadow box, and they were from that kind of 1988, 1989 time period. And it was just all stuff he got from that time period. So getting into the 2000s, most of these are not particularly hard. I think people have tried to say that one of these was harder than the other. This was an error. It didn't have Spring Fellowship. And while some errors are difficult, what happened is they got a full run of them in without the word Spring Fellowship and without any of the writing. Nayawin Rar Lodge at the top, or Nayawin Rar 296. And so they got a whole second batch in, and they got to keep the first batch. So, yes, I was told that they were only given to ordeal candidates, but I can just tell you from the number of them that I've seen floating around, either in local people's collections or in, just in various hands of people. People got them who weren't ordeal. Maybe they gave them out first to the ordeal candidates. I don't know why they would do that, but apparently they did. But definitely there were other people who got them, because I've seen them in quantity before, and I consider them just as easy as the next issue, or the one with the writing. None of these are that hard. I'm a little partial to this one, the 2007 Fall Fellowship. That one is the one that I went through my ordeal at, and I do feel like I don't see them as often, but I just like that patch too, so I may be biased. What was really weird was when I started collecting and started doing OA images, I went through my event patch collection and I said, okay, well, I'm going to be complete from the year I got into the lodge. Well, it turned out I wasn't. I only had one of the two 2008 patches. My memory is different from what's written here, and which is kind of sad because I wrote this book. But I think this is what I got from Brett. Now, Brett was an officer in the lodge at the time, so maybe he remembers better than I do. This was only a year into me being a member of the lodge. I remember one of these patches being given out to candidates, and that was why nobody had it, because it was not easy to get in trying to go back and get it when I was collecting. Brett said that this one was ordered by the scout executive without the knowledge of the lodge, and so they ended up with two. And so these were sold, not handed out at the event. So I really feel like I remember, and maybe it's something Wes told me, I'd believe that too, that this one was the candidate patch and that one was everyone else's patch. But I don't know. All I know is that when you have an event patch and you keep your event patch collection by, this is the patches that were given to me when I showed up at the event, and then you find out several years later you're missing one, you're very confused. And that was my case with this patch. It's just, you need to make sure you have both of them from that year, because I think some people in the lodge never realized that there was more than one patch for that event. Getting into these, this is notable really only because it was for a while categorized as an X. They called it the Blue Book X6, or it was listed that way on OA Images. It was listed that way because it didn't say Winter Fun Fellowship on it, even though it was a Winter Fun Fellowship patch, and there is a left and right to a lot of it for that matter. I don't actually think it's that hard of a patch. People do like it because of it's a military themed patch, and it went with a military fundraiser that the lodge did in coordination with the section, and that was a flap that was made by the lodge for that fundraiser. And so I think people collected it outside the lodge who would, with the flap as like two patches that go together, that wouldn't normally care about a Nayawin Rar Lodge event patch. So just some of that is some of the reason why. The rest of these are, for the most part, not difficult. And then you have the banana. It was made for a spring fellowship, and they made 150. I think most of these at this time we were making around 200. Just our events usually had around 100 people show up. Sometimes you had a couple more, sometimes you had a couple less. This one was one of those ones that everybody just liked the patch for some reason. And I mean, I designed it, so I'm glad they did. But there weren't a lot left over, and people at the end of the event wanted them. And so they actually sold them like round robin, and there just weren't very many left. And then because it was spring, people took them to Conclave in April, because we have our spring in March, and people paired this patch somewhat with our Conclave theme, which was going bananas. And so they got traded outside the lodge at Conclave to people who don't normally collect 296 stuff. So personally, I've always seen this as a fairly hard, event patch from this time period. It's probably about the hardest one from 2000 to 2012 time period. Mostly because all the rest of them are pretty daggone easy. Some of these, there were a couple more made, like 250 off. Most of them, though, around 200 made. This patch, I think, is quite hard. It's the 2014 Fall Fellowship. And the only reason it's hard is because we had so many daggone people show up for Fellowship. If I remember right, that was the year that there was one Fall Fellowship that we had 116 candidates. We had 100, for our lodge, is just an insane number. And I'm pretty sure it was this one, and I don't think everyone got one. What did I say? It's kind of neat to have this up because some of this I've forgotten since I did this. It's been 9 years since I did this book. Yeah, not everyone was able to get one. But if you were a Gold Card member and you weren't there at the event, you didn't get one because they just ran out. Basically everyone at the event was able to get one. And the only reason we went through so many, is because we had so many candidates. So once again, when candidates are given a large percentage of something, if we had 116 candidates, that's more than half of these patches went with them. Those patches, how many of them will ever come back into collectors' hands? And it's just not a lot. So that's just why that to me, that's always been a hard patch. In 2015, we had a big mess of stuff. And so our Midnight Madness patch got made. And they were passed out one per person to everyone in the lodge who stayed up for the Midnight Madness event, which was our centennial event and was our 70th anniversary event. So everyone who stayed up got one. And what was left after they were handed out to everybody got burned. And some of that was because there were people in the lodge who had worked very hard on making stuff for the 70th anniversary, and then the staff advisor messed it all up, basically, to put it simply. There were several flap designs that we had instructed, the LEC had approved, and they were supposed to be ordered, and they came in ordered wrong, and they came in ordered, instead of a quantity of 300, they came in ordered in a quantity of 1,000 apiece. There were multiple issues. And what it came down to was there was nothing special made for our lodge's 70th anniversary like had originally been planned. And so they decided we're going to pass this patch out and it was kind of a key three and several committee chairmen and everybody that kind of ultimately made the decision. But it was passed out, and the remainder of them was burned. And then there were the workday patches. They're honestly not that hard because we made 150 of them, and yeah, we had a good amount of people show up for work days, but at the same time, everybody was able to get two, or if you came and worked, you were able to get 2 or 3, and so they kind of got out there. They're really not that hard. Harder than the ones that were not earned, that you just got for attending the event, but not really that meaningful of a difficulty. So, and that is up through Fall Fellowship of 2015, and so really from 2000 to 2015, the only ones really to keep in mind is the 2014 fall, where most of them got given to ordeal candidates. Maybe the 2008, because there's some confusion because there's 2 event patches for 1 event. The 2012 banana, just because there weren't as many made. And quantity certainly does play a role in how difficult a patch is. And the 2015 Midnight Madness patch. So that was where I did the book in 2015. So I do have scanned the rest of these patches. Going 2016 forward, it's kind of just, my book is just left to right. 2016 wasn't hard. 2017 were not hard. Then we had a big change in the lodge. And this is where I want to talk about how you can have cycles. And it is determined by leadership. It is absolutely determined by the leadership of the lodge. But the leadership of the lodge can be influenced if they're not guided. They can be they can perceive things that then lead them to make decisions that are, in the long run, in my view, poor decisions. So you have to understand, when I was ordering patches, and this is kind of what this gets into kind of the cyclicality of these issues. I would rather make extra patches. If we're making a patch for an event, I'd rather make extra patches. And if I have 50 or 100 left at the end of the event, I am perfectly okay with that. Rather than have patches made for an event and we run short, something that everybody's supposed to get one. I'd rather make extra than we run short and there be 10 kids not be able to get a patch when everyone else has one. Our lodge back then, and I can't speak to if anything's changed really, but at that time when we did our event planning, in the registration cost for going to the event, it was like $3 were set aside, and that money was buying an event patch. In the total registration for the event patch was accounted for. And it wasn't accounted for at cost because, one, we never really knew the exact cost of the event patch event to event, but it was just accounted for at the same price we used to sell an event patch for in the trading post, and that was $3. So if you registered for an event, you were purchasing one of the event patches as well. In my theory, in Larry Lane's mind, if we had 100 people registered for an event, that's 100 patches already sold, that's $300. I really, at that point, based on lodge membership, saw no reason to order less than 300 of an event patch. And my reasoning was, well, okay, you could order 250 and yeah, you're probably fine 99% of the time, but at 250, you might as well order 300 and get the price break, because that was generally the price break. So that was my philosophy. And the patches come in, you give them out to the people who are there, and maybe like people like me would come in and the patches were $3 to buy an extra one. You'd usually sell 10 to 20 or maybe even 30 at $3 a piece. You've made money. You've made money on the order. If you have 100 left, who cares? Everybody's happy. No one's upset. Well, that was fine until I kind of took a step back from being as active in the lodge. I'd been at college and doing everything, and so I kind of take a step back as we get into 2017, 2018 time period, and people come into the trading post and they see all these patches. They see lots and lots of patches, and they go, "Oh my goodness, we've got to stop ordering so many daggone patches. We've got 50 of this patch left. We've got 75 of this patch left. He's got 100 of this event patch left. What was he thinking? He's insane." And I think that is a cycle that happens quite a bit in a lot of lodges. You have somebody who is more willing to make more patches, who's more willing to, okay, if we have extra, so what? And then at some point over time, over the years, the lodge box gets a little full. And somebody else takes over, or maybe lodge leadership says, "Oh, wow, we have a lot of patches left." And at that point, they say, "We need to cut production. We're making too many patches. We don't need to have any left over. We're losing money." Starting in 2018, we had a new staff advisor take over. And most of these patches are hard. They're not getting any easier. With a small caveat, and we'll mention in a second, it's just kind of silly to me. One, they raised the price to buy an extra event patch at an event now is $5. Most people in our lodge don't want to spend the same price they would buy a flap for to buy a event patch, so they don't sell any extra hardly at all, which is fine because they hardly ever have any extra to sell anyway. Most of these patches they have made between 100 to 150. And most of the times at one of our events, especially like Fall Fellowship, we will have around 100 to maybe 100 and a quarter go to the event. So the production runs have run so tight. There have been several event patches that we haven't had enough, where people have paid for the event patch and their registration fee, and then they've not gotten it. So that's kind of the era we're in now, where we were in this really everyone was happy cycle, and now we're in a cycle where people are not as happy. So these are some of the other event patches. You have the 2018 spring, you have the 2018 fall, 2019 winter, 2019 spring. So I'm a gold card member, which means I'm registered for every event, which means I should get one of every patch. I missed 2019 winter, and I never got my patch. And I had to trade for one, and it took me like 3 years. It was such a low attendance at the event that it took me like 3 years to get one, or something like that. It was just ridiculous. I mean, I felt like I was never going to get one of this modern event patch. Now recently, if you want to buy one for like $10, I think they are on eBay, and they are on eBay because all the remainder of this patch, as far as what I would understand, all the remainder of that patch and all the remainder of this 2020 fall were put on eBay by the staff advisor after they left the employment of Boy Scouts of America. They had taken all the leftovers with them, which was some of the reason why they were so hard to find. So that certainly can play a role in it. But I will say, almost all these patches are just very small runs. I don't really understand why we're not just making more patches. I don't get it. But every one of these, I remember the Leprechaun, which was kind of there at the beginning of when these started going all restricted and crazy. Pam Rooks, a good friend of mine, showed up at Conclave, and I had missed spring. I missed spring and I missed that winter. Those were two of the events I missed. And she brought it up to me. She handed it to me. She said something to the effect of, "I had to really make sure to get this for you. It was really hard to be able to make sure you got one." And I was like, "An event patch? An event patch? Really?" And no, she was serious. They ran so short that eventually it came down to, well, who are we going to give them to, and who's not going to get a patch this weekend? So, and that has really carried on through to about here. The Umbrella was very low production. They made a bit more of these. I'm not sure. It's like we had a little lull in the problems that we were having. It was around the time the staff advisor had left. So, yeah, around 2021, 2022, beginning of 2022. So it was kind of like, oh, things are finally getting a little normal. They were still charging $5 for an event patch, but okay. And then these kind of came out, and these were not as restricted. They made a little bit more of them. It was kind of this change in the leadership that saw where you had, instead of the new leadership going, oh my gosh, we have so many patches left, the new leadership were the people who were upset that they didn't have the patches, at these events. And so then they were able to make some more. So they made some more but it was only for about this 2-year period before they went right back to the problems we were having. The football player, they didn't make very many of. And these, I think they made 125 of the helicopter. They made like 100 or maybe 100 and a quarter of the fire truck. And they made 100 of the ambulance. And then they did a reorder of 25 for the ambulance, not realizing that they would probably need more than that. I haven't heard if it's been confirmed if they had to do a second reorder of the ambulance. But they did a reorder of 25. And once again, I'm just saying, make more patches. There's really not a lot of reason to only make 100 of an event patch. Especially, we've got 40 people or so, 50 people who are gold card members who should get a patch, regardless of if they're at the event or not, because they've already paid for it. So, but that's caught you up to date. I guess to quickly summarize, overall, most of our event patches are all very obtainable. Overall, none of them right now are very expensive if you want to get into collecting them. There's just not the demand to drive the price. If it's something that you want to start collecting, that's great. I will say, if you have a need from that 2018 to 2021, or some of these recent event patches, if you have a need in that time period, go ahead and get it. Don't wait. Because I don't think any of those patches, with how few were made, I have a feeling in the future we're going to see them they're just not going to be available. Not that anybody would, bid them up to some high price in the future. I'm just saying I just don't think you'll find them. So if you have a need in that time period, I would encourage you to go ahead and pick it up. As far as factors that can influence how hard these patches are, I've talked about it, I think, just about enough. But, whether or not the council supports the lodge, how many people are coming to events, quantities, those all matter. But I also think this cycle of people seeing, oh my gosh, there's so many patches. We got to stop. We got to stop having so many patches left over from these events. And then that flipping into now people are really upset because they're not getting the event patches for events that they've registered and paid to go to. And I think, hopefully, we'll see it flip back the other way to, okay, every event we're going to make 200 off. And yeah, that we might have 50 left over at the end of the event, but you know what? That's okay. And let me show real quick. I'll show this at my cursed event patch. So this is the cursed event patch. I will never get a mint one of these. I'm just convinced. I mean, I've been collecting the lodge, I don't know how long. I've had 2, and both of them were lightly stained. This one you can barely tell. I mean, like, just barely tell. But there is a little tiny stain at the tip of my finger up here by the W.